Let me bring in North Dakota Senator John Hoeven, one of the 12 Republicans who had dinner with the president last night. Good to see you, Senator. Good morning.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm well. How are you? I guess the question is, what did you think about what went on during that dinner? Give us your take on it.
Thought it was a positive, constructive, candid conversation about our debt and our deficit and how we've got to come together in a bipartisan way to address it. It's what the American people expect and deserve, and that's what we focused on.
Well, I think both sides have been saying that for a while, that the American people are fed up and they deserve a government that's a little more productive. But I guess the devil's always in the details. How does that happen? Do you think the meeting last night made, for example, the possibility of a grand bargain more likely?
I do. I think the president has to stay directly involved. You talked about other meetings he's having today and next week. He's got to continue this dialogue until we get the job done. And I think we actually talked about a framework and a timeline that can lead to a big deal.
Well, now that the House bill is passed, the Democratic Senate version is going to be looked at. It's likely to include amendments to help blunt the effects of domestic spending cuts and at the same time reforming the tax code, which by some estimates would bring in about $600 billion in new revenue. What's your position on that?
Well, are you talking about the CR?
Yes.
The CR that the House passed makes the reductions called for and sequestered. It includes two appropriations bills, defense and MILCON, but it makes the spending reductions in a more thoughtful way. It does not raise revenue. That bill is coming over to the Senate, and we'll act on it. I'm on appropriations. We'll add additional bills, again, to make the reductions in a thoughtful way. But this is the reductions called for and sequestered, not a tax increase.
But would you consider, if it goes that way, this proposal on the Democratic side that the tax code be reformed? They say it could bring in about $600 billion in new revenue.
Myself and other Republicans are willing to engage in tax reform, but not raise taxes, and that's one of the things we talked about last night. We need revenue, but we need revenue from pro-growth tax reform that creates, that comes from economic growth, not higher taxes. But I will say this, Chris, we talked about a process over the next 4 to 5 months that I think could get us to a big deal to truly address the debt and deficit and entitlement reform in a way that preserves and protects Social Security and Medicare.
Well, what was that conversation?
That we start with the sequesters we're talking about, with the continuing resolution. We now have bipartisan activity, which I think you'll see in the Senate, to make those reductions in a more thoughtful way. Then we go to the budget process. You're going to have different budgets in the House and the Senate, but you also have the debt ceiling. That creates a dynamic over the next 4 months to really come together on these big bipartisan reforms, because that's what's going to be necessary to address all those issues.
If you're optimistic, obviously you knew what the other Republican senators were bringing to the table. What did you hear from the president that made you more optimistic than you maybe were before you went into that dinner?
We pressed him hard on he needs to be involved like this on an ongoing basis, not going around the country. He needs to work with members of Congress directly until we get this done, and we pressed that very forcefully. And
you feel confident that he is going to do that. What did you bring away from it that makes you feel more optimistic?
Let me say I'm hopeful that he will continue this dialogue. I think we talked about a framework, which I just described, which I think can get us to the solution. And as one of your commentators said earlier, this is what the American people want, and that's why myself and others are pushing for it. And I think we have to push for it and get it done in this next 4 to 5 months.
Are there points that the president made in that discussion that you feel is a non-starter?
Well, sure, there are things we disagree on, no question about it.
And what would be at the top of that list?
He wants higher taxes, and that's a problem. Republicans agree there's got to be revenue, but you do it with economic growth. So let's reform this tax code, figure out how to do it where we get more revenue, but more revenue from economic growth. At the same time, we've got to control spending, find the reductions that we talked about with sequester and through other means, but we've got to get into entitlement reform that preserves and protects these programs for the long run. That's vital to getting the big solution.
Senator John Hoeven, it's good to have you on the program. And how was the food last night, by the way? Good dinner?
It was very good. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Senator. Good to see you.
Thanks, Chris.
David and